Shalom. Welcome to the Chai Academy. Welcome to the Chai Center. I'm Rabbi Sachs, and we will be discussing today the upcoming holiday of Purim. Now, the Purim holiday is an exceptional story. You know, we in the story of Purim. And how do we know the story, by the way? Because it's called Megillas Esther, the scroll of Esther. Esther wrote it down. Esther, together with Mordechai, her uncle, the hero and the heroine of the story, wrote it down. And then it was given over for posterity, and we read it on the anniversary of the story. Now, for those who are tuning in to Judaism or never heard of Purim, essentially there was a decree on the Jewish people. There was this wicked man who was the son of a wicked man, the grandson of a wicked man, great-grandson of a wicked man, all the way up to the times of Moses and Joshua. Came from the nation of Amalek, our sworn enemies. And he sought to dispose of the Jewish people, and he convinced the king, very powerful figure, who was, if you think of the England in its heyday, how much they owned. Well, this fellow Achashverosh. He owned he was in control of many lands and provinces, and he had many colonies, etc. And he convinced the king to annihilate the Jewish people. And through a whole sequence of events, it was eventually the decree, the annihilation did not take place. So, a couple of interesting things about this story. One of them is that there's 24 holy books, right? There's the 5 books of Moses. Then there was Joshua. Then there was, the Samuel, and then there's the other prophets, and then there's the writings, and we know Job, and we know Ecclesiastes, and we know of so many of the 24 books. This is one of the 24. This is the only one that there is no mention of God whatsoever. None. Obviously, in the 5 books of Moses, mention of God, but throughout the prophets, throughout the writings, throughout the Song of Songs and Joel and Obadiah, the last 12 prophets, etc., there's not one book that does not have God's name. That does not have God's name. This doesn't have God's name from beginning to end. Nothing. And it's very strange that it's a holy book. When Israel was founded, modern day Israel was founded, or prior to that, early 1900s, 1800s, there was a whole argument over the Hatikvah, the national anthem. It doesn't have the name of God in it whatsoever, and because it doesn't have the name of God, there were many people who were peeved. They said, okay, and they wanted the name of God, and there were people who were in government or government in exile. Theodor Herzl and etc., said, we don't want the name of God. We're done with God. We're done. And it became a whole argument, and eventually it was pushed through, but there are many Jews today who do not sing Hatikvah because God's name was consciously taken out. So that's a song. Can you imagine a whole book? A whole book does not have God's name in it whatsoever. How do we explain that? So, a lot of what behind the scenes of the Megillah is discussed in the Talmud and other commentaries. So, one of the explanations as to why there's no God in the Megillah, none, is because this story of the Megillah, when you read it, it takes about 20 minutes to read publicly. If you want to study it, it will take you longer. If you want to read it slower, it'll take you longer. If you want to study it with the commentaries and with the Talmud, it could take you years. But the story has 10 chapters. Each chapter has approximately 20-something verses, on average. So it takes you 20 minutes. And you say, oh, wow, fascinating. It's amazing what happened. One thing after the other. The king made a feast. His wife refused to come to the feast. And therefore he killed her. And then the new queen was chosen. She happened to be Esther, who was a Jewess, but kept her heritage from... Esther's uncle was the leader of the Jewish people, was the head of the Sanhedrin, and he got involved. And you say, wow, this is amazing. What you don't realize is this story of the Megillah took place over a decade. So it wasn't, we read it in one sitting. We read it in 20 minutes, 25 minutes. Half hour if you're a slow reader in synagogue. This took place over a decade. And it was Esther and Mordechai who connected the dots. The average person didn't connect the dots. So many different providence occurred. There was such divine providence that occurred with this Megillah, and that occurred with this story, that it was Esther and Mordechai, the hero and the heroine, said, we got to write this down. We got to write this down. Because it is incredible what happened here. And if you don't write it down, people will not be able to connect the dots. And they did. So they wrote it down, and it was given out to the Jewish community, and it became a law to read this Megillah every year on the anniversary of the story. Here's an interesting thing. It's called Megillas Esther, the Scroll of Esther. Now, when you look at the Megillah, it seems like Esther and Mordechai, both of them, wrote it down. So why is it only called the Scroll of Esther? The Talmud fills us in. The Talmud said, after the whole story took place, and the Jews were victorious, and they were not annihilated, and their enemies were killed, and it was just an incredible happenings. Esther wrote to the Sanhedrin, to the sages of that time. Mordechai was the head of the sages, and she said, "Kisvuni ledoros." Here's the scroll that was written with the story. I want you to place it as one of the scrolls, the holy scrolls, for posterity's sake, and make it holy. And the great Sanhedrin responded to the queen. Sanhedrin were the great rabbis. They were 71 sages that made determinations that basically it affected the way Jewish living happened. It was all the way from the first temple, through the story of Purim, through the rebuilding of the second temple, until the second temple was destroyed. There was a Sanhedrin, a court of law. The court of law, the Sanhedrin, when they received the scroll, they wrote back to Esther. Nowadays they would have emailed her, but they wrote back and said, no. No. We are not. This book is not going to... Esther, this book should be buried. The scroll that you wrote should be buried. It should not see the light of day. Because it will wreak havoc. So it says in the Talmud. Rashi writes, why will it wreak havoc? Is because if you look at the story of the Megillah, it says that Achashverosh, the king, was bought off with money by the wicked Haman. He was bribed. Then, the king seemed to be very fickle. And then there was a war. And the Gentiles lost the war. Then it says Mordechai paraded the streets, and there was a parade. And it was such a celebration. And Mordechai was dressed in royal garb. And so the Sanhedrin said, this story will create anti-Semitism? Think of that answer. The answer to you is, Esther, we're not going to place this book in our archives. Burn it. Because it will create anti-Semitism. Esther writes back, you're worried about anti-Semitism. He said, the story is already recorded in the archives of Paras Amadai, of Persia. It's already recorded there. You want to put blinders on? You want to put your head in the sand? You want to say this story never happened? It's there. It's there with all its glory. So if Paras Amadai, if the government can pick up this story, if the New York Times can pick up this story, if the Washington Post, if CNN can pick up this story, why won't you? And she forced them. You worried about anti-Semitism? Stop it. Stop it. This is a story that happened. It was factual. It was incredible. It was miraculous, albeit clothed in nature. And that's why God's name is not mentioned. And therefore, Kivuni Ladaris, I ask you again, make it a holy book. And the Sanhedrin acquiesced. And they said, okay. We will, it'll be one of the 24 holy books. The story of Hanukkah, by the way, was never canonized. The story, the Megillas of Antiochus, who was the wicked king in the story of Hanukkah, that was never canonized. Some people read it. You can probably find it in the library. It's not a holy book. It's not on everybody's shelves. Not everybody reads it. We know the story, but not everybody reads it. This book was canonized. And it became a holy book because of Esther's cajoling. And Esther says, there were miracles here in abundance, albeit miracles enclosed in nature. Some miracles are obvious. Because what is miracles enclosed in nature? It means it wasn't an obvious miracle. But when you connect the dots, it was an obvious miracle. An obvious miracle is when God splits the sea. That's an obvious miracle. An obvious miracle is you have enough oil to last for 8 days, for 1 day, and it lasts 8 days. That's an obvious miracle. The story of the Megillah on Purim, there was no obvious miracle. There were miracles, for sure. Vashti, the queen, died. Out of all the women, thousands of women, that Achashverosh slept with in order to know whether he wanted her as his queen. He wanted to try the merchandise before he bought it, right, without being too vulgar. He chose Esther. Esther. So that was a miracle. They had so many other women to choose from. He chose Esther, who was a Jewess, who was instrumental in saving the Jews. And so she said, it has to be holy, otherwise people are going to think it's an interesting story, but not miraculous. God is not involved. And I Esther says, purposefully withheld God's name to show you that it was a miracle enclosed in nature. What's a miracle enclosed in nature? Today, I believe a miracle enclosed in nature is a baby being born. Conception took place 9 months prior. There was a sperm in the egg. And they met. Now, you could dismiss it and say, yeah, science. Or you can say, wowzers, this is a miracle. This is a miracle. You can dismiss a lot of things that occur in the world and say, yeah, it's science. It's nature. It happens. It's a fluke of nature. But as Jews, we say, wow, this is a miracle. And that's what Esther wanted to point out, that there were miracles enclosed in nature. Now, so because she pushed and pushed and pushed, the Sanhedrin, it became under her name. But that's not the only reason why it's called Megillas Esther. And once again, this is what they don't teach you in Hebrew school. After the victory, sorry about that. After the victory, the wicked Haman was put to death. And the Jews defeated their enemies. And Mordecai paraded in the street. There's the rest of the story that they don't tell you. And it's a very, very tragic story. And that is Esther. The threat was against everybody. And wicked Haman was killed, right? The Eichmann was killed. Goebbels was killed. Julius Streicher was killed. But the threat still continued. And Esther begged the king to withdraw the decree that on the 13th day of Adar, all Jews should be killed. And the king said, I will not withdraw the decree because I can't, but I will allow the Jews and I will weaponize the Jews to fight back. Once the generals of the king's army heard that, they bowed out. Certain people, other people, strong people bowed out. So now it was a war against rabble-rousers. The generals of the army, the military, took a step back. And the Jews won against the rabble-rousers. They took their axe, they took their hatchets, and they went out to war. And they won, and it was all said and done, etc. As great celebration. You know who never celebrated? Esther. You know why she never celebrated? It's because the story of Esther is a tragic, tragic affair. When Vashti died, and this is why the name is called Megillas Esther. When Vashti died, and Esther was literally raped by the king, and the king says, yes, I want you to be my wife. She didn't want to have sex with him. She was prepped for a year, like every other girl, every other virgin. Prepped. The skin cleansers and lavender and oil and bathing and the skin was perfect, the hair was perfect, and their body was sculpted so that the sex crazed Achashverosh can have his willies, his jollies. She lived with this tyrant. And when the story was over, she still lived with this tyrant. It was over, you see, it was over for everybody else. But it wasn't over for her. She still remained married to this Gentile king. She was not married to a Jewish man living in her own house, making her own challah, lighting her own Shabbat candles, baking matzah. She lived in the palace, right? Where she was, yes, she had a life where she was serviced, but the life was not her own. The life was not her own. She was the queen. And she died as queen. She died as queen. She was never stepped down. She never became, abdicated her position. She couldn't. He was a tyrant. I don't want to be married to you anymore. I don't want to be queen. Well, she would have been a head shorter. She would have been decapitated. So she lived her whole life, the story of Purim. Her whole life. She was Achashverosh's wife. And she never got out. That's a reason. In addition to her insisting that it's written, the story is written. The story about her, the rest of her years, she didn't write. What's the point? That's a Debbie Downer. But she wanted it written to show people the miracle. The sages came to their senses and said, she's also an incredible person. She sacrificed her whole being, her whole life, her everything. Yes, she had children with him. And yes, these children were technically Jewish. But they were Persians first because they were princes, Prince of Persia. So she never saw Jewish nachas from her kids. She saw Persian nachas. She saw nachas. But it was all lost because of her predicament. Powerful stuff. And so therefore, it's called Megillas Esther. The story, the scroll of Esther. Because she was the one that gave up everything. Well, the Jews, yeah, they fasted. The Jews, they fought. The Jews, they prayed. The Jews, they celebrated. She lived it her entire life. Now, the day before Purim is known as the fast of Esther. Now, many commentators say the reason why we fast this year, Wednesday is going to be the fast. Wednesday night we'll hear the Megillah, and Thursday's Purim. So Wednesday night starts Purim, but Wednesday we fast. So why do we fast? So we fast, seemingly, the Talmud disagrees with this. That's what I mean, filling in the dots of stuff you didn't learn in Hebrew school. Esther, when Mordechai found out that Haman had bribed the king to kill the Jewish people on the 13th of Adar, he didn't find out the day before. Do you know when Haman approached the king? He approached the king exactly 11 months before the 13th day of Nisan. And he said, I've chosen for the date, via lottery, Purim, the 13th day of Adar, to annihilate the Jewish people. That's when Mordechai found out. He goes over to Esther, and he goes, approach the king, beg the king, tell the king, tell him to stop this nonsense. It's death and destruction. And Esther said, I can't. I can't go to the king because I haven't been summoned to the king. And the law of the land is if you walk into the king's royal office without being summoned, you're put to death. So Mordechai said, I don't want to hear your excuses, Esther. This is why you became queen. Miracle, right? This is why you became queen. Go to him. And she said, okay, I'll go to him. But first you got to fast. 3 days. Beginning now. So she fasted on the 13th, 14th, and she went to him on the 15th, on the 3rd day of the month of Nisan. Well, do you know what the 15th day of Nisan is? It's Passover. She told Mordechai, don't worry about the Seder. Don't worry about the matzah. Don't worry about the wine. Don't worry about the bitter herbs. Don't worry about the charoset. Don't worry about the lamb. Don't worry about the Seder. Fast and pray. And I too will fast. So for 3 days, they fasted. 2 of those days was Passover. The Seder nights. They fasted. And so many people say because of the fasting and the praying, and Esther, when she entered the royal office, she was not killed. That's why we fast today. The Talmud says it's not true. Because everybody fasted. And this is called the fast of Esther. We know that the 17th of Tammuz is called the 17th of Tammuz. The 9th of Av, another fast day, is the 9th of Av. This should have been the 13th of Adar, but it's not. It's called the Fast of Esther. Now, do you know why it's the Fast of Esther? Because only Esther fasted on that day, on the 13th day. Everybody fasted during Passover. On the 13th day, the day before they were going to battle, or the day of battle rather, only Esther fasted. Everybody else was fighting a war. The day you fight a war, you're not allowed to fast. Who was the war against? Men, women, children, the elderly, the young. It didn't matter. If you were a 12-year-old kid, you had to defend yourself. If you were a woman, you had to defend yourself. If you were a senior geriatric, you had to defend yourself. Everybody was at war. They couldn't fast. There was only one person that fasted, and that was Esther. Because she was safe in the palace. And that's why it's called the Fast of Esther. Not because of the fasting that they did 11 months earlier. Because that everybody fasted. So that's why it's called the Fast of Esther, because on that day, the day of the war, she fasted, and only she fasted. So it's called Megillas Esther, the Scroll of Esther, because of her tragic story and her insistence that it should be done. It's called the Fast of Esther because she wasn't fighting. She was on her knees begging to God and fasting. Everyone else was fighting to death. And that's why it's called the Fast of Esther. And the reason why God's name is not mentioned is because it wasn't magic that there was no war. There was war. What was a miracle is the Jews killed their enemies. And the total amount of Jews killed was negligible. Every life lost is terrible. But it could have been a slaughter bath. It could have been it could have been a tremendous bloodbath. A slaughterhouse. You ever been in one? That's what it could have been. It could have looked like the Civil War, in Virginia. The bodies, how they depict the bodies laying there and rotting, decomposing on the fields. Gettysburg. But it wasn't. The Jews survived. And they ended anti-Semitism once and for all in that period. It was a miracle. But it wasn't just God said, okay, poof, they're gone. No, they had to fight for it. So it was a miracle enclosed in nature. Tomorrow we're going to talk about the role of Esther, how brilliant she was, and how she was literally a psychologist. Amazing stuff, amazing stuff. We see how she was the quintessential diplomat, the quintessential manipulator, and it's just amazing. So tomorrow we'll discuss that. We'll also discuss the laws of Purim, etc., etc. I'm asking you please share this class with others. And you can find it on the chaicenter.com/academy. You can find it on YouTube. You can find it on Anchor. You can find it on Spotify. You can find it on so many other places. Please share it and review many of the classes that we have. God bless and happy Purim.